Good evening, everybody. Welcome in the EDA. I'm Henry Lucas, professor at the Design Media Arts department here, and I'm pleased to introduce JüRg Lehni. JüRg was born in 1978 in Lucerne, Switzerland, worked in London, and studied at the Eidgenössische Technische Hochschule in Zurich, Hyperwerk in Basel, and the École Continentale d'Art in Lausanne. He is an independent designer, developer, and artist, not always in that order, I think. Over the past year, he worked on a family of projects that are all linked through these topics, and most of these projects were collaborations with people from other backgrounds: graphic designers, artists, typographers, and engineers. He was present at the Graphic Design Now in Production show at the Hammer with an installation called Empty Words, which he made with Alex Rich. What else can I... Oh, he did projects with Swiss type foundry Linedo.com, had a research residency at Sony's Set Lab in Tokyo, and had numerous exhibitions. His drawings machines called Hector, Rita, and Victor I am totally in love with, and that is probably because they make such romantic drawings. JüRg is also our Arts Council visiting professor for a whole year, so he's teaching classes. If you're not in one of his classes, address him and talk to him. He's very friendly.
Trying to be.
So, JüRg Lehni.
Thank you, Henry. So I'm glad I don't have to introduce myself. So Henry already mentioned my struggle with the titles, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But first, this is my name, and if you want to find some information online, I removed my website about 3 years ago, but Lehni.org currently just has a couple of links to other things I'm involved with, and there's also a Vimeo account. You find some information there. I will have to make a website eventually again. I wanted to start with this lovely quote that I found, or actually Alex Rich found this. This is Hans Richter, the German painter, graphic designer, avant-gardist, and experimental filmmaker. And so he talks about his practice, and I can really relate to this. So maybe I'll just quickly read it. I had hoped, actually, hard to read here. I had hoped to follow my art line straight through, but what I had to do to survive was, besides commercial art, the editing of newspapers, working in a fashion designer studio, writing reviews, lecturing, designing catalogs, and God knows what. Yet in this way I could do with my art whatever I liked. Abstract, avant-garde films, long scrolls, big abstract designs, which nobody wanted to have, abstract collages, paintings, reliefs. And in the end, I could even draw a kind of moral out of this double role. It kept me in steady contact with people, customs, and society. And so I really like this because nowadays we're in this world where young artists always feel like they need to be immediately like in the commercial world of like galleries and selling art, etc. And I always felt that wasn't so, I mean, for me, I don't speak generally, but for me personally, I actually didn't really want to end up there because I felt like it's much better to have this freedom where I don't have to compromise and I can try out these things without any pressure of a commercial gallery or the need to sell or to even think of sellable formats. Another quote I like is by Rainer Banham in his book Los Angeles, The Architecture of Four Ecologies, which relates to me now being here since 4 months. And there he says, so like earlier generations of English intellectuals who taught themselves Italian in order to read Dante in the original, I learned to drive in order to read Los Angeles in the original. And that's pretty much how I feel. I actually got my driver's license a year ago. But that was before I knew I was going here. But this is a really good exercise in driving. And How this relates to the works is maybe questionable at the moment, but it will maybe make some sense later on. The image you're looking at is actually by an artist, Edward Burtynsky. It's a photograph of a series which is all about oil. And so obviously there's an aesthetic in this construction, which I don't think when the highways were constructed, they were thinking of this as being something aesthetic. I think it's just purely pragmatic, trying to solve a problem of routing cars through a city in an efficient way. And if you step away and look at it from above, then you start seeing the logic that you don't really necessarily see when you're inside, which is similar to that of maybe pneumatic tubes as used in early days by the Victorians to transmit telegrams to nearby buildings in pipes that airflow regulates the flow through. So there's a sort of like programming happening that if you participate in traffic, you're sort of a part of a bigger logic that you don't necessarily grasp. But also there's an unintentional aesthetic as a side effect almost, which I'm interested in. Another example of that is this, which is Skywriting. This image is from the Library of Congress of the archive, and it's not quite clear when this happened, but this is something we all know from nowadays, but it's actually not the same. Nowadays people do Skype typing, which means that there's multiple planes flying in parallel and the smoke being turned on and off in each of these planes, so it's like an inkjet printer maybe. And this was actually one pilot flying those shapes like calligraphy, so he was sort of drawing, and it takes a skilled pilot to do that, I think, because you're not really aware of where you are as you're in the plane, I guess. But what I like about this is this trial of to find new ways to communication that we always. I mean, this is something that's never ending. Like human beings always try to come up with new ways of communicating. I mean, this was maybe just for advertising, so it would sort of attract people's attention. But that this development has also a very strong link to technology at any moment, to like whatever we can actually do, whatever means we actually have at our disposal. So again, this is. I'm not sure I'm making this clear enough, but I think again this is something that where the aesthetic or the solution that we come up with is strongly influenced by technology that we have at our disposal, and so something that people are often not so aware. And so together with Alex Rich, one of my many collaborators, we started creating this archive called The Recent History of Writing and Drawing, where we collected many of these facts or these little bits of information from the history of technology and communication and displaying information, writing, drawing, and which is almost like an alternative history to design, where we're not talking of styles or currents or culture. We're talking just of means of production, but that has such a strong link that is often forgotten, and so. Another example is, for example, the neon sign, how you bend glass in order to shape letters. And this again, you could say this links to how the pilot has to fly a plane, because a plane has a speed. It can't just stop and make a corner. So in order to do the T, the pilot flies on many circles where there's no smoke coming out of the smoke device. And so in very similar ways, if you bend neon, you have to follow certain rules, and the person who makes those signs knows all these rules and knows all the tricks. And again, that informs the aesthetic. Another example here is this is from a website called gpsdrawings.com, where people are obsessed with the idea of attaching GPS devices to anything that moves. And just record whatever the drawing is that this moving object is leaving behind. So in this example here, which I particularly like, it's the little car that drives around and draws the football field, or the soccer field, I guess, in this country. And so you see the logic unveiled in a way, like how he has to drive in order to draw. So he again, he does a lot of like extra ways that you don't see in the result. The funny thing with this website is that they, as I said, they attach it to all kinds of things. For example, dogs going on random strolls, or people actually deliberately going on walks to write messages, or drive across the whole country and write something. So it's worth a visit. So I think what all this is about maybe is, in the end, is you could say they're all gestures or unintentional gestures. You know, anything that we produce has always a certain way that something is produced. It involves, if it's an automatic process, it involves machines that make things, and they will necessarily have some sort of handwriting, even if that's maybe not, no one ever thought about, you know, the way they do it, but they were probably just pragmatic solutions to a problem. But I think there's a sort of a hidden poetic potential in all this, and that's also the reason why together with Alex we were creating this this archive, because it became almost something that fueled our practice and informed the works that we were making and the attitude behind it. And so in a way, I think we started seeing that as sort of like the ingredients for cooking, or the words to make sentences out of, so the core components in a way of the work. And this topic of gestures now brings us to the next topic, which is this series of drawing machines that Henry was relating to. I've put them all on one screen, so I don't talk endlessly about them, because usually in my lectures I would always go on way too long about these machines. So the top left one is called Hector, and I've created Hector together with my friend Uli Franke, who is an engineer who I met at the ETH when I studied a bit of electroengineering, or electronic engineering, I guess you call it. Unlike me, Uli finished his studies and became a really good engineer, and so when I finished my studies, then in visual communication we collaborated and ended up making this machine, which was triggered by an observation that I made while studying at the University of, the art school in Lausanne, the École. At that time, a lot of students were sort of celebrating the aesthetics of vector graphics and computer software, and this sort of very clean results that come out of that. And they were often not questioning the role of printing or the actual influence of the software on what they were making. And so I felt like I wanted to set something against that. And the idea then was to make an imperfect drawing device that is imprecise and has sort of a struggle with gravity, and has sort of human qualities in like the fact that it's not always succeeding the way you maybe intend, or it has its character on its own. It's kind of something that is really almost, you could say, grumpy or moody. You have to learn to draw for it. It is really restrictive in a way, and so it has a lot of limitations, and a lot of artists know that good things come out of limitations, not out of endless freedom. So it was almost the idea of like deliberately limiting what a machine can do in times of like endless possibilities, like through technology. So what was funny was that I didn't actually think about it making visual results. I thought about it making drawings, but I didn't think of them being things in motion. I just thought of them as something that you make and then they're on the wall. And then as the machine worked, it turned out to hold this potential for performances. And so it sent me on this journey into the art world eventually, where these moments of production actually became the main piece, and not so much the drawing on the wall. Or the boundaries were blurred between what is the actual work, what does the work actually consist of? Is it the drawing being made, or is it the drawing on the wall? And then also, who is the author? Because you're watching a machine making something. So, but who is that ghost hand behind it? And then the machine at the top right is called Rita, and it's another drawing machine which came out of the urge of taking the narrative qualities in drawing further and building a machine that would allow instrumentalizing that. And so this machine not only draws, but it also erases. As you can see now, it's changing, I think for the second time, the haircut there. So it can change tools between different colored pens, actually like whiteboard marker pens. and then also different types of sponges, like a small sponge to erase bits of the drawing, or then the big sponge to erase the whole thing again at the end. And so the focus shifts from a production to an endless reproduction, and the drawing becomes a sort of a the technique for a display rather than it being a printing device. So it's like a very slow display that would update itself. This machine was built at the Tensta Kunsthal in Stockholm for an exhibition that I had there together with, well, there was Rita and Hector, the two drawing machines, and it was a collaborative project, as actually most of my exhibition projects ended up being very collaborative, because I think the two main components, I actually forgot to mention that before, but now is a good time. In a way, I can break down my practice to these two core components of the making of these platforms, sort of like scenarios for production, or like counter proposals to the prevailing technologies, and then collaborations in which I explore the potential of these platforms and sort of I find the voice of what these platforms or machines are about, and that's not always clear in the beginning when I build them. That's what I call the Frankenstein moment. When you work with software, you don't have that so much, or I don't have it so much because I work a lot with software. So when I work with hardware or with mechanical installations, there's this big unknown, which is the sound of the motor, the strength, the vibrations, the role of gravity, the friction between the wall and the tool, etc., how much pressure it requires. And there's so much of that you never know. As you build the machine, you have no idea what the machine's actual chest or character or voice is yet. So there's this whole, that's what I call the Frankenstein moment, is when you first see it. It's often more than you sort of expect it to be, or something different. And then you go on this journey and find out what it is. The third machine is called Victor, and is the continuation of the idea for Hector. So this principle of triangulation, using triangulation to position something. So instead of an XY system that normally is used in a plotter device, like on the top right. And instead of 2 motors, Victor has 4. And it was built with the idea of it working on way bigger scale, so on large outdoor walls, with spray paint again. But at the same time, Victor was extremely complicated to produce, and while I was working on it, I got really bored with spray paint, because, I don't know, spray paint in the beginning was there because it was imprecise and rough, but also it allowed me not to worry about pressure towards the wall, because it doesn't need to touch, so it's actually really easy to apply. But then everyone put me into the street art corner with this work, and I got a lot of invitations of that culture, and I wasn't really interested in ending up there, so I avoided that. And it was never intended to be like the robot graffiti artist illegally putting tags into the city. That wasn't really my intention. I'm not actually judging that culture, but I was just not so much interested in it. And so what was nice with Victor then was the realization that having 4 motors would actually allow to have a little pressure towards the wall and do something else. And chalk is almost like the opposite of spray in some way, that it's ephemeral, it washes away with water. It's also imprecise, so that there's that quality, or a different kind of stroke quality, but it just seemed like a nice way forward. I will speak a little bit about some of the works I've made with these machines after. And then the fourth video that you're looking at is actually, you could also say that, again, seeing a machine doing work, but in this case it's a software, it's an algorithm. And this algorithm is called flood fill. So in Photoshop, when you fill an area of pixels with a different color, the software that figures out which pixels of the neighboring colors have to be changed in color. I mean, basically, which neighboring pixels have the same color. That algorithm is called flood fill, and it's about 10 lines long. So it's a really simple algorithm, rule-based. And when you slow it down and make it visible, it has this weird quality of, there's almost a physicality to it, or it looks like sand flowing into containers or water. But also there's something where sometimes it stops in one place and carries on someplace else, and then goes back and revisits an area where it stopped drawing. So it's almost like watching someone doodling. As a child, I had a C64, and it had a drawing program. And on that, unintentionally, the hardware, because it was so slow and limited, it was actually making that algorithm visible just because it was working in the memory of the video card. And because the processor was so slow, you could actually watch it. That wasn't the intention of the engineers, but there was no other way. There was no double buffering, as engineers would call it. So that allowed me to discover this, and I spent a lot of time on the C64 just drawing shapes and seeing how they would be filled. And like decades later, I remember that experience, and I used it to make it work. And what I like about it is, in a way, it relates to these other machines, but the logic doesn't come from mechanics or physical constraints. It comes from software and pure mathematics. But there's an interesting analogy there. So I made a couple of works using that. And what you're looking at there is just a clock. So this was taking 1 minute to draw the time. And it's using different fields. There's a fill in the background and then the seven segment display in the front. And they're actually disturbing each other. So there's this kind of playful element to that. And I still want to make it physical somehow as a clock that you could just put in your living room and it would constantly draw the time for you. And that links back to the sand, because that's probably the first clock that ever was invented, sand flowing into containers. I think that's enough about that slide. Some examples of using Hector that I want to talk about. So this one here is at the MoMA in 2008. So this Hector was created 2002, so this is 6 years into Hector's career as an artist. And I felt like the servant sometimes. Kept me busy, let's put it that way. But so here I got invited to be at the MoMA in this show called The Design and the Elastic Mind. But at the same time, the MoMA wanted Hector to draw the title to the show. And I was like, well, those are two different things. One is a design commission, and the other one is a participation in an exhibition. And if I'm designing the title, I should be paid for it as a designer. And so I felt a bit cheeky to highlight that, but at the same time I felt it was really important, because there is always this argument of high exposure by these important institutions that you as a young designer should just be grateful for and not say anything. And so I just wanted to see what's going to happen, and I wouldn't have said no, of course, but I wanted to sort of push that. And so in the end, the solution was that I thought it would be nice to allow the machine to talk about itself rather than the show. And so what you're looking at is not the drawing of a text, it's actually the drawing of a motion diagram that makes the text. So it's almost like an information graphic that explains how the machine is drawing the text. And I did that just by not turning on and off the spray paint. So it's like the airplane that we saw if the smoke device would always be on. And that's why I showed you these slides, because that's now we're starting to make these connections. So Irma Boom was the designer of the catalog and the signage, and she really liked the idea, and she helped me convincing the curators. The key selling argument was that it took an elastic mind to be able to read this, which apparently worked. The only how do you say that, concession I had to make was to put actually this drawing here onto the wall that would basically be like the reading manual for this drawing. So here you see blue is what I drew, and red is what the software calculates to make those to come up with this motion that wouldn't tremble. And this is a simple algorithm, a geometric algorithm that I developed after like trying out lots of different things, because Hector was so unstable and trembling, and so we had to treat him really gently. And so basically the solution was, and now this links back to the highway, treating it like a car without brakes that just has to constantly run on circles, and to make sure that it can actually get onto the lanes that would be the text in this case. So the software that we're looking at is called Scriptographer, and is a plugin for Adobe Illustrator that I made that I'm going to talk a little bit about later on. So I've made this platform, and then I've used it to make this series of drawing machines and other things. Some other examples. So this is a collaboration with graphic designer Laurenz Brunner, a Swiss graphic designer. We were both on a residency in New York, a Swiss design residency that we both won in the same year, and then ended up doing this little collaboration, which was about like formal exercises about circles. But it was basically an exploration of different drawing styles and techniques that Hector could be using. And they were sold on the spot and afterwards. I still have some, if you want some. Price has gone up. We were way too low there. It's $800 now. Just kidding. It's actually true. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I'm not good with selling artworks. My favorite is the bottom right one, which I call the Zen circle, because it's an endless circling on the same circle until the whole can of spray paint is empty, which is also in value, I guess, just in material value, the most expensive one, because it uses one whole spray can. And it's also the most smelly one, and it's hard to roll, so the shipping is more complicated. Some of them are like references to existing artwork. So there's a Bridget Riley, and there's I forgot his name, the sunflower. Anyway, it escaped me. And lastly, one other collaboration together with Dexter Sinister from New York in the same year while I was there. This was sort of a revisiting of the early works of Hector, because the first patterns I made were actually like test images to figure out what it can and cannot do. And here we were sort of going back to abstraction at the end of the machine's career. The official end was 2009. That's actually I did something in 2011 as well, but sort of ended in 2009. But this was one of the last pieces I've made with it. So these are Lissajous figures, which are mathematical diagrams depicting harmonic motion, so sort of like a pendulum, but a pendulum with no decay in momentum, so an endlessly pendling pendulum. And so, or you could also say like two oscillators describing X and Y motion, whatever. There's different ways of describing this, but there's a strong connection to Hector, because Hector you could describe Hector as a function of two changing values, these two belts, these two tooth belts. And that's exactly what the Lissajous figure is as well. And also, they never have corners in them. They're always round. So you could argue that they're sort of like they're sort of Hector's native tongue. Hector doesn't need to do any extra motion there to draw these. So it was nice to come back to like full circle at the end and making these diagrams. And so then, since those harmonic frequencies, they also talk about sound, or a sound source could also make Lissajous figures. When we drew these, we were actually picking up the sound of the two motors. They're stepper motors, so they're really high-pitched, high-frequency sounds. And we were feeding them back into the space, so it became extremely autoreferential in many ways as a performance. And it was going on and on and on. We were making 8 of these throughout the whole night, and the space was filling with fumes. But people were sticking around for the free beer, Belgian beer. And so it turned out into a really successful night. Somehow that it was sort of, I don't know if the spray fumes had some like, probably like, it's a bit like sniffing glue, I guess, after a while. And it was totally not, I don't know how that bypassed health and safety in the US, but maybe because it was at the Swiss Institute. Luckily we didn't get sued. It was, yeah, it worked out well. Everyone had a headache the day after though. So, let me jump. I like the sound a lot. Anyway, you get the idea. And then just quickly, here's the the poster that we made, David Reinford from Dexter Sinister and I. So this was, we were using this really old pen plotter, and this actually goes back to the early days in a way, the C64. My brother had a C64, he's 4 years older than me. He's a graphic designer now, and he actually influenced my sort of path through these different areas also. But he had a C64, and we actually had a little pen plotter with it, and I think that totally inspired me to make these works later on. So it was quite nice to go back and find one of these really old devices and make it work again with Scriptographer, and then draw these Lissachaux figures and scan them, and then we printed them using a newspaper printer, a cheap one in Chinatown in New York. Actually, I meant to mention this also, speaking of my brother, because when I talked about the different hats, I think that's maybe something I wanted to say, is what I like about not caring or not giving myself a title is it creates this confusion, like we just had it in the introduction. It's kind of hard to introduce what it is I'm doing, and I'm really struggling with it. But I started thinking of it as sort of like there's two ways of talking of it. One is I like the term crop rotation, especially in German, because it's actually called 3-field crop rotation, because you always have one field lying dormant, and the two other fields you seed, you like plant and harvest. And so that's pretty much how I feel. I have this, there's art, technology, and design, and these are like my interests. And there's always one that doesn't get the attention it deserves, but it took me a while to realize that's actually okay. So that's one way of describing it. And the other one is, when I'm struggling with it, then I call it the Bermuda Triangle between those three. So, but I mean, as a piece of advice, maybe, I don't want to say everyone has to do this, but it's nice to try not to give yourself a title, your profession. Don't name it, because in a way, I think the work can speak for itself, and maybe we're slowly moving towards a time where we don't have to label it as art or design, or I mean, those are just that's just mental scaffolding, or like a manual for reading or viewing, which maybe is not necessary anymore. Hopefully, maybe I'm just dreaming. But now, I wanted to talk a little bit about some things I've made with Victor. So Victor was finally ready in 2008. And together with Alex Rich, we had this solo show at the ICA in London, where Victor was one of the exhibits. And so we were using it to support a format of lectures once a week. And we invited different people to engage with this machine in sort of like, they could be lectures or they could be performances. It was open to the people to decide how they wanted to use the machine. And the people were selected by the topic of, in a way, what I talked about in the beginning. So sort of the role of technology in the designing process or the process of an artist, and the impact of technology on society. So we try to broaden it and not just talk about design and art, but also other aspects. And that turned out to work pretty well. And I mean, obviously with the chalk and the blackboard, you sort of create this familiar scenario where people immediately think of going to school. I mean, maybe people above a certain age, but I don't know if they still use blackboards nowadays. But it creates this sort of classroom situation which offered itself to this format. And so one of the lectures was by Michael Marriott. He's a furniture designer from London. So this is the ICA in London, in the lower gallery. And so Michael was speaking about the history of seating, or the history of chairs, through advances in chair-making technology, but he was actually talking more broadly about just development of the world in general through that, you could say. So last 5,000 years was the span that he talked about. The first one was the Egyptian stool at the top left, which dates back to about 3,000 before Christ. Then there's the Thone chair here. I'm not going to mention all of them, but Thonny chair number 14, which is regarded as the most successful industrial product of the 19th century, nicknamed the consumer chair. Thonny struggled for years to produce a version which would be suitable for mass production, and succeeded in 1859. Early versions were glued together from laminated wood, but in 1861, Thonny succeeded in making the chair in solid wood with screws, not glue. So this is just something that I read about that chair. So basically, all of these chairs had these stories about them, how some new discovery in some new production facility would then lead to a new type of aesthetic or a new topology of chair almost. I mean, you could argue that the Thonny chair now, it's not just a simple design, it's actually like a whole topology of a type of chair. There's the overall, where's the mouse? Sorry. Struggling with technology. There's the Alvar Aalto chair in 1932, which it's called Paimio lounge chair, which he designed for a sanatorium where people with tuberculosis had to relax. And this is this one here. So it's all out of bent plywood, birch plywood. And so again, that is a process that wasn't existing before, and he was researching a lot to actually make this happen. And so this was how Michael was talking. And then there were some funny moments where sometimes he would go on and on for way too long about one of these chairs, and I would just decide to slowly draw the next one, forcing him to catch up. And also, it kind of created this crazy situation where you could either just watch the machine draw, which is in a way almost enough in itself sometimes, but then you could listen to him, but then there would be this battle between the noises because the machine squeaks with chalk and rattles and has a lot of like characters, and so there's this weird kind of duet going on. An interesting chair is this one here, the cantilever chair by Marcel Breuer from 1929. Actually, it's kind of hard to attribute this chair because, again, the idea actually comes apparently from tubular steel, bending it, which was invented for the bicycle, so the handlebars, and then would trigger this idea of making a chair in the same way, the fact that we could now bend metal in this way, or tubes. And so, again, it created a whole typology, and there's the design is not just attributed to one designer, and I think there was a lot of like disagreement on who invented it, and Marcel Breuer is one of the people who gets attributed, but it's not clear. And so this is something that we might know nowadays from the field of design, that whenever there's something ready up in the air, it pops up in many places, and people sometimes get offended. I personally had to encounter this situation with Hector. I'm sure you've seen some of the similar machines that have been out there since, and it was kind of, so there's been like a lot of versions of this kind of drawing machine using that V principle, or some people call them polar graphs now, and there's the V plotter, that's one term for it. So there's been a lot of like works being made in this way. Some of them reference my works, some of them don't. Some of them reference people who have referenced my work in the past. So it's something that when you build such a thing and you encounter this situation, it's kind of hard to digest first, but then you also realize like you've thrown it out there, and you can't just expect people to navigate around it. I mean, obviously people see it and want to build it or want to expand upon, and so that's design as culture, so it's a dialogue. But then also what was really interesting was that eventually I found someone who made something like this, and it predates what I've made, so that was a good lesson too, that I realized, okay, I thought I invented it, but I also didn't. And so it's an interesting situation to find yourself in, and I think maybe the conclusion is to not really care about those things. But I'm sure those people, they were battling each other about who invented the cantilever chair. And it's only human to do so. Also, I think culturally, we're living still in a culture of the idea of owning ideas. The whole patent system is built on top of that. And so it's a whole, to be an inventor is a whole can be a business model. I mean, you just can come up with useful ideas and patent them, and actually not be interested in realizing them, but you just sort of put your name on it. So in case someone else ever comes up with it, you can drag them to court. Those people are called patent trolls. So yeah, it's an interesting challenge to culture nowadays, I guess. Yeah, what else is there? I can talk way too much. This is a Swiss chair, so I should maybe quickly mention it. It's the Landi-Stuhl. This was built in 1939 for the national exhibition in Zurich, and it's one of those design items that now is in lots of design museums. It's extremely lightweight, made out of aluminium. It's a really beautiful object. And this one here was fun, actually. This is Arne Jacobsen's hand chair, and it took extremely little time to draw it. It just made these 3 lines and this one outline. And then as it drew that, Michael realized that he was saying, like, that's funny because the chair was actually built to be produced really quickly. So, and in the same way, it was really easy to draw it. So there was this nice kind of moment where that was actually helping the lecture. Yeah. Too much information, maybe. This was about the problem of food distribution. Lila McAllister runs this food shop in London, organic foods, and she has different people across the country in the UK that she brings food from into the city. And in England is maybe one of the early countries that eradicated a well-functioning model of distributed markets, like the local markets. People would buy and sell locally, and there would be not be one like centralized storage facility that everything would go out from in lorries. That's what industrialization brought to England very early on. Did they invent that stuff? I'm not sure. Or is it the US who invented industrialization? Both of them. But so, in a way, what Lila is proposing is, together with her colleague, who is working on a system where they use GPS and the database, and they track lorries that would go back empty once they delivered the goods. And so people could use this system to use that capacity that would otherwise be remain unused. And so there's this proposal of using modern technologies to solve something that's been created as a problem. What's funny about this talk is that they didn't have any drawing that they wanted to provide, and they just wanted to talk about this. And so the solution that we came up with Alex was to use Paul Barron's network diagrams. And he's an American researcher who worked for RAND and ARPA. And he drew these network diagrams for the government, basically proposing a network structure that would survive a nuclear attack. So basically a system that is decentralized, and there's not one centralized core that if you hit it, then everything goes down. And this is actually what led to the invention, or one of those components that led to the internet as we know it now. But what was nice was that, in a way, the same vulnerability was built into this industrial distribution model where everything is like centralized, and you don't care about transportation because it's so cheap. So it was quite nice to actually just draw these, and they didn't even see them before, but as they were drawn, they started referencing the diagrams immediately. So it became a tool for them to actually explain abstract concepts. And they used the system to bring lettuce into the city. And so every visitor was holding a salad. Some people started eating. It was like being on the farm with rabbits. No, it was nice. Running out of time a little bit, maybe, so I should go quicker. This here is from a little more than a year ago, where I was invited to Chengdu in China, in Sichuan, to a design biennial, and I participated with Victor, and for the first time I was able to install it on a scale that I actually imagined it, but actually it could go 4 times that size even, in 2 times in each direction, 4 times that surface. Um, and so here, I actually, for once, I did the lecture, and you will recognize a lot of these drawings. So I was talking about a lot of the things I'm talking about today. Some of the things I've already mentioned, some I'm not going to mention. You see the handlebar and the chair. You actually see a patent that describes a setup like Hector that I discovered. But this was actually for almost the opposite. It was actually to just paint the wall in one color. So it wasn't actually thinking of making line drawings. It was just about going left, right, and filling the whole wall. So you could almost say like it's the opposite of Hector. It could undo what Hector does. There's that little cloud there with the Apple TV and the inkjet cartridge and the Nespresso, another Swiss invention, the Nespresso capsule. So a little bit of coffee and built into an aluminium capsule and sold at, I don't know, maybe 1,000 times the cost of raw coffee. I'm not quite sure, but an insane amount more. And so this was to talk about business models that use technology to lock consumers in, because the Apple TV is a device that is basically a computer, but it doesn't work like a computer. It only allows you to consume. You cannot make things with it. You can only watch. So it places you where the company wants you in your living room as a good consumer. And the inkjet cartridge actually allows you to make things, but is not such a nice system either, because you buy the printer really cheap and then you buy these inkjet cartridges full of ink, and once they're empty, you're not supposed to refill them. You're supposed to buy new inkjet cartridges, and they actually have chips in them that would prevent you from refilling them. Even if you refilled them and you didn't reset the chip, the device would say it's empty. And the reason why is because the cartridges are expensive, the printer is cheap, and the cartridges actually have the whole technology in them to print. So the printer is the dumb device that just moves the cartridge. And I feel it's kind of upsetting that. I mean, that companies have this approach to technology. And so part of this lecture was about this more open attitude towards technology in general and computer technology in particular. But now what's nice about these things is they exist, and we can take them and make things with them against the intention of the makers. I mean, we don't have to be those good consumers. We can reappropriate them. And that's something that comes later on. I mean, that now appears maybe more in my work as an attitude. This talks about a similar problem, but within software. So this is Adobe in 2003, I think. They started doing this Creative Suite. Before, there were separate softwares, and then they started unifying the whole thing. And they had this brilliant idea to use the periodic table as a metaphor to show their whole empire on the color circle. And so to me, this looks more like a battlefield, or like the Spanish Armada attacking the UK or something. I feel that's a problem. This is not great. Oh, it's pretty, but it's not good. Because basically it's one company defining the whole field, the whole creative sector. Of course, they're not the only ones, but they're the main ones. There's very little competition in many of these areas. And also now we're 10 years later almost, and I'm sure there's, I'm not sure, is it 2000? I think actually this is 2006 or 7. I'm saying it wrong. But anyway, we're a couple of years later. There must be like double the amount of icons on this now. So this is problematic, I think. And my little contribution to changing this was a scriptographer. So this is now, again, while I was studying at École, observing how people would celebrate vector graphics. Not so much questioning the role of the software or of the computer in their creative process, but just sort of going with the aesthetics. I felt like it would be nice to confront that and, in a way, open up this closed software, or one of them, and in this case it's Illustrator, and make something that would allow people to not just take the tools that are proposed by Adobe, but make little helpers inside that closed software and open it up and make that part of their workflow. So this was inspired by John Maida's Design by Numbers, which was a software that also inspired processing, I think. And it also appeared around the same time. I think so. Casey and Ben Fry and were probably working on processing around the time I was working on this. And but the big difference is here that this is, I was not thinking of screen-based interaction so much. I was really thinking of making that programming-based workflow part of printmaking. So sort of merging the traditional field of graphic design with this. And that's because I was collaborating a lot with graphic designers, and I was really interested in what the computer does in that field, or what the role is of the computer in that field. And it's also a field that was very early on probably hit by the impact of the computer, like typesetting changed, type design changed completely and eradicated whole professions in very little time. People were really upset or frightened very early on. So it's kind of what happens in other fields now, maybe like the film industry going away from 35mm film now. It's kind of the similar impact then. So just to quickly illustrate some of the ideas. So what I was interested in was not so much also what we call a generative design, but I was more interested in this this idea of, I call them little helpers. So not Santa's little helpers, but mine or yours. So basically, you would use scripting to make a tool that you can still use by hand, and you could give that tool behavior. And so what we're looking at here is a work by Jonathan Pocky, who is a designer from Amsterdam and became a really strong user of Scriptographer. Scriptographer was part of his, part of what he was working on. I was part of one. It was one of the strategies maybe in his design work, not the only one, but an important one. And so here he made a typeface, which is not using the operating system normal format for typefaces, but it's actually, each letter is a drawing, a line drawing, and then each letter has attached behavior. So each letter knows which parameters can be changed and which ones cannot. And then you type a text, and then you use the mouse to place each letter, letter by letter. And then as you click onto existing placed letters, you can drag and you can change them, but you don't have to use the white or the black arrow and go and select that handle and make sure the other ones are also selected so you don't distort the shape. So it all does that for you. And by doing that, it becomes playful to work in this way. And so you're ending up doing things that you wouldn't be doing if it was that tedious work with those little white and black arrows. And I think this is illustrating the idea really well. And I think what's interesting is this friction between working by hand and working automatically, and both sort of influencing each other. And the result has an interesting aesthetic often, that you can see the presence of the computer, but at the same time it feels handmade also. And you can see that the person who made it had fun making it, which I feel is often not the case with computer-based design work sometimes. So what's also interesting is that sometimes you just make these tools and you use them once. You just make it for one poster, and so it becomes this bespoke tool for one work. And so there's this sort of craft-oriented attitude in that, which I like. This is a tool that I made. The funny thing is, for me, Scriptographer was more about these drawing machines that I showed you. I made some works with it also, but not so many. And it was mainly then turning into an interest about the platform itself, which is always part of my practice anyway, that I'm more interested in making the platforms than maybe using them alone. So I became way more interested in using it for teaching and simplifying it, that people can learn how to use it and things like that. But here is one example that a tool that I made, and I just put it out there and made it available for free. So basically it imitates paper, and you can have a backside and a front side, and then you can fold it once or multiple times. And this is available on the website. You can download that and have fun with it. I was speaking in the past about Scriptographer before, because actually a couple of months ago I decided to end it because it's a huge effort to update for CS6. Adobe has changed so much in their softwares. They had to do that. It's not their fault, but it's just a situation now where I would have to invest like 3 months of like full-time programming work that I don't have to make it work. So I felt it's time to part ways. But there's a way forward, which I will show you shortly. Just quickly to talk about the teaching that I mentioned. So here, this is a very packed classroom at École in Lausanne, where I was teaching together with Jonathan Pucky. We were teaching during almost 3 years, once a semester, so twice a year. We would be teaching a 1-week scripting workshop, where students with no prior knowledge of programming and just sort of college or high school level of math would start making these tools. And one thing we discovered was that the fact that in Illustrator you can actually inspect what you do, what the programming does. You can use these tools that you already know to inspect what's been produced. And that's sort of like almost touching it. It's almost tangible. It's not, of course, not tangible, but it almost feels like it's as close to tangible as it can be maybe on the screen. So you can use the arrow, you can inspect the coordinates, you see the dimensions, and you see how that relates to your code. There's actually a mistake in there. The height has the wrong number there. Should fix that. That turned out to be really useful. Also, design students tend to already know what Illustrator does. So you already have sort of a mindset, and then you learn how to do that in code. And so that really helped with teaching. The works that we asked them to do was mainly based on the idea of making drawing tools and sort of coming up with ways of describing what the line does as you move the mouse, putting that into simple rules and then programming it. And this is just one of many of these sketching sessions that would happen. So a lot of students would come to us with these pages and explain what they want to do. And then we would try and find ways that can be put into programming. And I'm just going to show you one example. So here is a group. They always worked in groups, which worked pretty well too. So this is a group that wanted to make a family of drawing tools about architecture. And actually, I should mention that. So they were asked to make a group of tools that would sort of speak the same visual language or would together form a world or a visual language that would be coherent. So in this case here it's architecture, and they ended up making this tool that would allow you to draw one row of images, of windows, and then using the keyboard you could grow the house. And then there was another tool that would allow you to turn off and on the lights in each room. And so it's a very simple tool, but again, like in no time they made these cityscapes that you could feel that they had fun doing this. This was the final poster. They were always making black and white posters. There was no color allowed, which they often didn't like. But it helped focusing on the shapes rather than making it pretty with colors, which is not as easy, which is easier than making the shapes work. And then they made a day version as well. So I guess they made this one first and then inverted the colors and switched the lights off. But yeah, I think you can really see this enjoyment of your little helper. And I think it has an interesting aesthetic because you can still feel it's handmade. I don't think this looks like a 3D rendering or a computer-generated poster. So I think there's something really interesting in that niche that we wanted to explore. And then this project then led to paper.js, which I've been using now last year at UCLA for teaching a similar class in the grad course. And so paper.js is basically, you could say, a scriptographer for the web. Oh, it's loading it on the wrong screen. So I just want to quickly show you this. So it's basically like you can use the same type of programming. This would not run this slowly. I think it's because the screen is recorded at the same time. But so on the website, basically it's just a programming framework. So you can, like jQuery, for example, you can use it to make any structure that you want with it. And it comes with a very permissive license, the MIT license. So you're not very restricted in open source terms. And so any example you see on the website, you can click the source button, and the source is actually code that you can edit. So I can actually just try out changing things and then running it again, which was, so basically the website is a code editor, a coding environment. So hard for me to see here. So I can say I want more points. So this is something you should try out at home, it's fun. It comes with examples. I'm just gonna click a couple. This is one we ported over from processing, which emulates a chain. And when you click the mouse, it unveils its internal structure. So Paper.js basically just allows you to work with vector graphics in a very convenient way on the web. This is one we call tadpoles. And when you click, they align to an invisible shape. And when you hit spacebar, then they unveil their structure. Say no more. Yeah, you should just go and explore this by yourself. It's fun. And then if you want to learn it, there's a lot of tutorials, and there's a reference. And I'm now working on bringing more of the features from Scriptographer to the web. So this framework, I mean, this environment that allows you to inspect what the programming does. I want to sort of recreate this outside of Illustrator, so I don't have this dependency on the Adobe universe anymore, because I don't actually hold a grudge, but I just feel like I was way too dependent from one company, and it puts me in a bad spot because I'm totally dependent on their decisions, and I don't know what their plan is, and they're not open. I tried to get in touch many times, but every time they start a new product cycle, there's a new product manager, and so you restart from scratch. I was pretty close to actually getting somewhere twice, and then it just starts from zero. The person moves on, and so you start with new people, and it was really frustrating, so I gave up, which is okay. I think this is way more exciting. Again, I don't know how much more I should show. I have a couple of more things I could show, and I've been talking an hour now, so I don't know. What do you think? 15 minutes? Yeah, that's good. So, empty words. This is the piece that was installed at the Hammer Museum until January 6th. So this is was also in the exhibition at the ICA, and I created this work together with Alex Rich. So this is this attitude of the reappropriation of existing technology rather than making it from scratch. So here what we see is a setup where there's an industrial vinyl cutting machine that normally would cut the sticky sheet layer of a vinyl over like a, well, the vinyl sheet of a sticky sheet, I guess. I don't know how you call it in English. But it's for vinyl signage in exhibitions, for example, normally. But we've changed it into this machine that would allow you to cut through the whole paper and make these posters. So you can sit down and type a sentence, and the machine does the layout for you. And eventually, once you're happy with what you've written and you like how it looks, you can confirm it, and then the machine is cutting it for you. So it's basically a service that is run in the exhibition, and it's very generous because you get to take that home for free. But there's also sort of pressure, because mostly when this is in an exhibition, there's a queue. People really want to make these posters, and people look over your shoulder and see what you're typing, and you feel pressured, and there's the pressure of it actually being made physically. And you can only make one a day mostly. I mean, most exhibitions that this was in. So there's this kind of nice process that you're being put through. And I quite like that. Also the fact that there's a lot of limitations. There's only a maximum of 5 lines of text, a certain amount of characters per line, depending on which character. And some words might not even fit. I was told California doesn't fit. And so you have to hyphenate it, but it doesn't hyphenate it for you. And also you can't change the alignment, you can't change the leading. There's a lot of, it doesn't allow you to do the things that you're normally used to do on a computer. And it doesn't have a mouse either. It's more like a typewriter. And so it has a lot of limitations that it makes very visible, and that's intentional. So you get something, but you have to go through this process, and you might find that process frustrating, but that's intentional because it is about making that role of technology visible. That's, again, that concern. You can also say it's a confetti machine because the room really fills with those white circles, and the people in the institutions find them everywhere. Like years later, they would find them in their socks, and which, yeah, it's like the carnival in Switzerland. It's exactly the same thing. You find those colored ones, colored circles years later, it's still somewhere at home. So this exhibition usually consists of that setup that you can use, and then there's the component of the works on the wall, and that's decided by Alex and I, and we ended up, we were both really interested in language, and we both ended up collecting a lot of sentences that we felt could fit the poster, and somehow at one point we were realizing that a lot of them were actually song titles, so that became the structure for us, like another constraint, you could say. So we ended up collecting lots of song titles, and then we made these almost like compositions. So they become the ingredients that you then work with. So when the grid is on the wall, there's sort of a connection between them. There's like a story flowing through them, and you hear a song if you know it. Then I wanted to share this nice moment here. The machine also has this rhythm when it works. And so this was in London, and this gentleman came up to us, and we were making a new set of posters for the wall. Wow. We were there on a Saturday afternoon in a gallery, and he just came up to us and was really happy about what we were doing here, and said, like, asked, "Can I dance for you?" And we were like, "Yeah, sure." I was a little embarrassed. And Alex had his camera ready, and he was filming it. And we had no idea what was going to happen. And so he explained afterwards that he really liked what we were doing at the ICA, because historically the ICA was this a location of experimentation in London in the 80s, where it wasn't very streamlined what was going on there. It was very experimental, and he felt that it had lost the edge, and that wasn't happening so much anymore. But then he said that we were sort of bringing that back by turning the gallery into like a workshop or an event space rather than something static. So he was very grateful and wanted to give something back. But he wasn't familiar with the process yet. And another lucky coincidence was that we didn't know what was going to happen. This was actually the next lined-up poster that we were going to make. Now he read it. And he doesn't stop. Yeah. There's no screws on the wall. So we make these holes so you can hang them, but there's no screws there. Yeah, this was such a nice gift to receive. Should I end here? No, actually, let me jump to one more work. I've been talking way too slowly about this stuff, or maybe I've put too many things in there. I meant to explain about the typeface. We can skip that. Oh, dear. Okay, very quickly. After having made this exhibition at the ICA and traveling to a couple of places, we started translating each of these works into the form of a book. And while doing that, we really enjoyed this idea of them being translations rather than documentation about each work. So at the top left, you see the cutting machine of empty words now using a pen and drawing the drawings that Victor made. And then we were scanning these and printing them white on black. And at the top right you see a paper drill, a manual paper drill that we used to make an edition of 800 books about empty words. And there's this really strange moment that there's this computer-controlled machine that makes one-offs, and then we make an edition of 800 about it, and we do it by hand. There's something really twisted about that, but I really like that. And it was actually quite efficient, but it still took a whole week of drilling. So 800 books of 6 double spreads, and each of them we had to do 6 times in stacks of about 150 pages. So we ended up with 36 times about 36 times 180 holes or so in average. So there's a lot of drilling. At the bottom left you see a device built around the inkjet cartridge that we discovered. So the inkjet cartridge that I just mentioned, now starring in this beautiful poetic object, you could say, that this company in Germany had this brilliant idea that since it already does all the work, all you need is a little pen built around it with a button and a facility to put a sentence onto the inkjet cartridge or onto the pen, and a little driver that would then feed letter by letter to the cartridge. And then as it pressed the button, the printing process starts, and it assumes a constant speed. You need to move the hand, otherwise the letters don't appear, they all end up on one spot. But by doing so, you become part of the printing process. So you're like the inkjet printer. You can print backwards and the text comes out backwards, or you can go on wavy lines. And so there's something really nice about this. I mean, it's not an object that had maybe so much use, but it's a really beautiful use of the inkjet cartridge. And we were turning it into, we were basically using it as a ready-made in the exhibition, where we then selected daily news. We curated news every day in a way, and headlines basically. The limitation is 30 characters. That's all you can put on there. And so every day we had 3 of these devices in the exhibition, and every day we were selecting from different news channels. We were selecting 3 headlines that then the visitors could print on a postcard. And so that postcard sort of becomes like a souvenir of that day, which the day is defined not by a date, but by what happened on that day. So I'll show that in a moment. So here, this is the outcome of all that drilling. So all the stacks and all the counters. And here's a quick tour through the books. So this one is about that inkjet cartridge printer. It's called Speed iJet. And so these are the headlines from the exhibition we had in Switzerland at the Kunsthalle St. Gallen in 2009. Can you read them? Crashed used plane was on autopilot. British boy became father at age 13. You might remember that. I remember that. Some of them are good. I mean, they're all good. Study finds positive outlook gene. United Nations foil pirate attack. And it's hard to read from here. You can read it better than me. I like a burglary. A burglary? No, it's a kangaroo. And then there's inequality is bad for your health. Girls do better without boys. That's pretty good. Yeah, anyway, so they just become these nice souvenirs of that time, and even if you Google them, yeah, probably true. Yeah, so even if you Google them, you would still find like where they're from. And here, so this is the book about Victor. So it's using this white ink on black paper to reference the chalk drawings, but the aesthetic is very different. So they're all translations. They're all not the original works. And they're kind of opaque. They don't talk about the work. They just put it into a form of a book. Last one. One more? The laser one? Sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to show something that's more work in progress, and then I end. Sorry, this is taking way too long. This is a project I worked on last year before coming here, which is, I call it Moving Picture Show. That it was an experimental setup in Chaumont during the exhibition, the poster exhibition originally, but now it's more like a graphic design festival in Chaumont in France. And so I was invited to propose a project, and I wanted to work with the machine that does the subtitles on 35mm film. This was a fascination of mine for a while now. That this machine is you always see it in Switzerland because you always see subtitled movies when you go to the movies in Switzerland, and the way the text appears, there's something really interesting about it. It sort of floats above the film, and you can see it's sort of burnt into. But I never knew how it was done until I found out it was done by using lasers, and actually something like a plotter, and which controls the laser and burns into the surface of the film, burning away the emulsion layer. And so I was really fascinated by this, but I had no idea how the setup looks like. And when I got invited, I still had no idea how the setup looks like, but I proposed to use the setup and instead of doing text, to change the setup. So instead of just burning text, it would allow me to burn any kind of drawing onto each frame of the film, and then use that setup in collaborations with invited designers to make a series of short movies. And so it was very experimental and really hard to tell where we were heading. Also, I had never actually projected film, or even I didn't even have an idea actually how many meters of film just 1 minute is, which is 20 meters. I don't think in feet, but that's about. How much is that again? 60? It's a lot. And so one feature film is like 20 minutes of film is 600 meters, and one full feature film would be like 3 kilometers, or like 2.5 miles of film. And so as I worked on this project, it kept getting more complicated. And I eventually found this company in Geneva that would allow me to rent this setup. And then we had to transform it. I was working with tinkerers from Zurich who are really good at that stuff. So they're called Defect. And they're really good at like changing or fixing old technology. And so we ended up building a new controller that would actually control the laser, and everything else was kept the same. So we were working with like 90s technology. So the laser nowadays would be way smaller, but that's what we ended up using. And so there's this really intense, dangerous laser, and then there's a lot of optics and mirrors, and then all the mechanics that will move the film, and then the whole setup would just very slowly, frame by frame, burn an animation. What we see here is sort of a revisiting of one of the earliest computer artworks, which I now forgot the person's name. Probably Casey, you know. He made this hypercube, and this was again together with David Reinford from Dexter Sinister. We wanted to revisit this animation, so we made a new version of it. And the original was actually in 60 millimeters, so now this is now burned onto 35. It's hard to document when you can't really film 35mm film. You get this like disturbing double images. But funnily enough, the iPhone turned out to be the best device to actually document it. Yeah. So this is very much work in progress. I still have to find the voice, I think, of this setup. I don't think I've quite figured out what it should be doing yet. But the process was very interesting. We were during 3 weeks, we made 6 short movies. What we're looking at here is a work by also David Reinford, where he used Metafont to make animated text. So Metafont is by Donald Knuth, is a parameterized typesetting system from the 70s, late 70s. And it allows you to make dynamic text, and David was making this dancing typeface, you could say, and the text actually talks about the invention of metafont in general, specifically, but also about more philosophically about maybe the model behind something and its actual shape that it takes on, or like the description of the abstract letter form and how it turns into a physical shape. So there was a quite nice relation to how we actually then produced this. There's a close-up of that. Yeah. And this is the last slide now. This is a work that I worked with James Goggin on. So we both had this fascination for moire patterns, and we were curious to see how that would translate into this aesthetic. So here, I think you can probably see quite well how there's a kind of a irregular quality to these lines. It doesn't feel digital at all, and it's hard. You see it much better in real than on a recording, but you can really see that the lines are burned and they're irregular and they flicker. And you also get like dust accumulating in the corners, which prevented the laser from actually reaching the film. So there's like a shadow of dust sometimes that in the corners that would happen during production. I never worked with animation before, and I think I really underestimated the amount of time it takes to make something move, especially if you want to compose. So this is this project needs a next step, I think. Yeah, I think that's about it. I probably stretched your attention enough. So, yeah. Are there any questions or things you want to know or things I haven't explained well? I wouldn't actually see. No questions? Yeah.
So it seems that the human is really important in your work, like this kind of human aspect that comes through the work, either as part of the process or that's shown as a result of the work.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just curious what your hopes for technology are, but also maybe also what your fears are.
I think, yeah, that's a good question. I think my hopes are that technology remains in our service, and in an ideal world, for me, it would be an open structure that is inviting to actually make things with. And at the moment, it seems, I don't know how dramatic it is, but in some ways, I feel we're at some sort of a crossroads sometimes where companies like Google or Apple, they are really trying to, I mean, they need to make profits, of course, but they're really trying to use this structure as a sort of a consumer lock-in, like I talked about. And I get really upset about a device like the iPhone, where, I grew up with a C64, and the manual on page 1, it already explains you, basically starts with basic, and that's what Casey talked about and his colleagues the last week. So basically, there's such a difference to what we have now here. This is just like a magical device. I mean, magical is the term that Apple loves to use. So it's a magical device, and it's like a shiny surface, and there's no interface other than the touch. But you can't really program with touch. Or maybe you can, but it doesn't want you to program it. They don't want you to put any scripting engine on it that is not theirs, that they cannot control and lock down. So in many ways, it's just problematic. But I mean, there's also a lot of good stuff there. I mean, there's never been as many frameworks to learn programming and make things with electronics like Arduino or processing or Paper.js or all these things. And it's every day almost there's a new one. Maybe not, but at least every year there's a couple of new ones popping up. So I don't know. I mean, I think in my work I'm just trying to communicate that this openness towards technology, and I want to make technology seem approachable and transparent, and not something like, not a black box, not something that doesn't want you to understand how it works. And that's also why a lot of my machines are so transparent, maybe. I mean, you can look at them and you understand how they function, maybe. You don't necessarily know how they're programmed or how they're engineered, but they're not like a laser printer where you don't see inside and the paper comes out and has print on it. Perfect. So, and I think in that way, I was just lucky that in a way I grew up in a time where technology had this transparency because of maybe technical limitations, or, the plotter would imitate what a person does by hand. And that was just the first step towards what we have now. And so this openness was naturally there. It wasn't anyone's intention perhaps, but it was just in the air. So now there's more and more layers of abstraction between us and the actual technology that does the stuff. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah. More questions? Yeah.
Did you ever try the flood fill algorithm with Hector?
No. It's such a pixel-based thing, and Hector is so much vector-based. But of course you can, I mean, when you fill with Hector, then you'd sort of, you could see that. No, I never did it. Could be nice to try, actually. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah?
No other questions? Then I would like to thank you for the talk.
You're welcome. Thank you.